The sabers are rattling as we come closer to a face-to-face meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Joe Biden in Geneva. While many hope the sit-down meeting will help ease the friction between the two nations, their countries' militaries are flexing their muscles, and many believe it's obvious the show is directed at one another. RT's Alex Mihailovich has that story.
Nestled in nature, the idyllic Swiss city of Geneva is known for its calm and serenity. The perfect place for the heads of two superpowers to meet, especially when their current relationship is nothing less than strained.
If efforts from both sides take place, we can count on relieving a certain tension.
A bilateral summit between Russia and the United States was initiated by President Joe Biden in April. The meeting is scheduled to take place on June 15th and 16th in Geneva, Switzerland. However, as a gentle breeze propels windsurfers on Lake Geneva, not far from where the two leaders will meet, the U.S. and Russian militaries are moving to a very different beat. U.S. armed forces join NATO allies in military exercises stretching across the Atlantic and through Europe towards the borders of Russia. The drills include thousands of NATO troops, a number of warships, and dozens of aircraft, in what some are calling a show of muscle aimed towards Russia. Here's NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg.
This exercise is a long time planned exercise, but it sends a very important message also in the current situation, that NATO is ready, NATO is there to defend all allies. And this exercise sends a message about our ability to transport a large number of troops, equipment across the Atlantic, across Europe, and also to project maritime power.
Meanwhile, in a response to NATO activity, Russia announced plans to send at least 20 new military units, like the one seen here, to its western border. And it will increase the presence of both its Navy and warplanes.
The actions of our Western colleagues destroy the international security system and force us to take the relevant countermeasures. We are constantly improving the operating strength of our forces, and by the year's end, we will form another 20 units and formations in the Western Military District.
Those Russian units are said to be armed with the latest in weaponry, and according to the Russian defense minister, 2,000 new pieces of hardware will be deployed in the area throughout 2021. While the military posturing is anything but positive, hopes are that cooler heads will prevail at the diplomatic level. Both the United States and Russia have signaled that they are open to putting all subjects on the table.
We're ready to talk with the United States. We have no off-limit topics.
By many, this is seen as a step in the right direction towards airing all grievances in Geneva and potentially easing tensions while creating more cooperative measures between the two nations. For RT, I'm Alex Mihailovich.
All right, and for analysis, we will turn to Dan Kovalik. He's a professor of international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and author of The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, How the U.S. is Orchestrating a Coup for Oil. Dan, good to see you back in town, back with us. Let's start here with the NATO meeting that's set to kick off on June 14th. But the 20-nation group is already kicking off their exercises in the Black Sea. The NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg, says this is not flexing at Russia. I'm paraphrasing there. I don't think Jens Stoltenberg would say flexing, but that the NATO's policy towards the Federation is based on two pillars: strong military deterrence and dialogue. But do you view that as the case here?
No, Manila. It seems to me that it is based on the pillars of aggression and, in fact, no diplomacy. There's been no diplomacy tried with Russia for years, even though Russia has extended the olive branch on a number of occasions. To send these type of forces into Europe on the eve of the first summit that's been had between the U.S. and Russia for years is not a good sign.
And yesterday, the Pentagon confirmed something called Operation Allied Sky, which saw the U.S. and NATO allies fly fighter jets over all 30 NATO countries. And as we know, NATO has had a slow creep to Russia's doorstep over the last 20 or 30 years. Could these moves then be seen as provocative by the Federation?
Absolutely. Of course, they're seen as provocative. They should be seen as provocative. Could you imagine if Russia had troops, thousands of troops in Mexico, and was flying jets over Mexico on the border of the United States? This is, unfathomable. It would never happen because it would be seen as an act of war. These are really acts of war that are being aimed towards Russia. And of course, they will see it as aggressive.
Now, all this is coming ahead of this long-awaited face-to-face meeting between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin in Geneva on June 16th. The White House says President Biden will focus on human rights abuses by Russia, presumably in reference to Alexei Navalny. But Biden has yet to say a word about Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, both who are still being pursued by our DOJ. So what do you think is going to happen when they talk to each other about this stuff in Geneva?
Well, I mean, if all Biden's going to focus on is Russia's alleged human rights abuses, instead of talking about joint ways that they can deal with, big problems confronting the world like the pandemic, global warming, and joint security, then I think it's going to be a short meeting, like the meeting that the U.S. had with the Chinese in Alaska. They just got up and left. Russia doesn't need to be counseled about human rights. I think the U.S. needs to be counseled about human rights. But more to the point, the U.S. and Russia have many things in common that they could be talking about, and that's the things they need to be discussing.
Yeah, I think Sergei Lavrov outlined a host of items that he wants to have discussed in Geneva. But on the U.S. side, surprisingly, that's really all the press statement was issued that said it would focus on human rights abuses by Russia. So how much of that do you think, Dan, is just political posturing for Joe Biden?
I don't think it's posturing. I agree with Noam Chomsky, who said for years that the U.S. has given up on even trying to learn about diplomacy. The U.S. doesn't do diplomacy anymore. It does war. And I just think it doesn't know how to talk to other countries in a respectful way that gets results. And I would be shocked if they do that with Russia this time.
Yeah. And diplomats here obviously hoping to ease tensions between Russia and the U.S., especially since the Biden administration has backed off those sanctions threats against companies who do business with the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline. But have we crossed the Rubicon on relations, or can Russia and the U.S. still perhaps find détente?
Of course they can, and they can still find it because Russia, to its great credit, has always extended the hand of peace to the United States. That is still being offered. And so really it's up to the U.S. If it wants to reset relations with Russia, that possibility is there.